Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you especially to Hakan for inviting me. This has been we've been in contact for a while since Hakan joined us at an event at Goldsmiths. So I'm absolutely delighted to be part of an exchange coming over here. So this is really a treat to join you here, and thank you all for coming. So what you can probably judge from the title of the book that I'm working on, finishing on, The Pink Pound, that the answer to do capitalism and homosexuality have a history is yes. The book is exactly what that is, that there is a longer history than the more recent past that we think about, say, from the era of gay liberation from the 70s and 80s, as marketers and advertisers more openly thought about LGBTQ, G, consumers in the first instance, and then expanding that as we go forward, but openly discussing how to attract these kinds of consumers or trying to understand what their buying habits might be. But in fact, they had been grappling with a lot of these questions for a good 100 years before that, if we start to ask different kinds of questions. And so that was what I was drawn to across the course of my PhD, and since then as part of some of my postdocs, and the monograph that I'm working on. Which way is this going to go to move forward? I just have to be more authoritative when pushing buttons. So of course we have seen ads like these. I mean, we're inundated now to some extent with what seem to be very transparent calls to, well, still very gay consumers, very white, cis, gay male consumers for major brands that we're starting to see and starting to recognize for some time now that capitalism has been interested in people that look like me for the most part. And of course, historically, there is a predisposition toward looking toward certain kinds of consumers based on actual or perceived economic possibilities, power, resources, all of these things. That shouldn't be surprising to those of us in the room, but the fact of there being a history that does this through most of the 20th century should be a bit more surprising to us, because it's fascinating to see how business enterprise was grappling with how to define people that didn't always necessarily define themselves in the ways that are familiar to us, or were being bandied about by advertisers and marketers and capitalists. So it's interesting to think about how these categories are being created in different contexts, how capitalism is imagining people together in certain categories based on real or perceived differences in sexuality, in gender presentation, in gender identity, when those people aren't necessarily linking themselves together. And I'm thinking quite broadly here across the entire 20th century. So if we're thinking very early 20th century, late 19th century, when the idea of a cohesive queer identity, gay identity, trans identity, any of these things that bring people together doesn't really exist in a meaningful way, yet capitalism might be saying, oh, these people are different in some way, and they're different in stereotypical ways and often homophobic or transphobic ways. They're identifying people that look, behave, seem, appear different, but then layering that onto perceived buying patterns and perceived choices of consumption. It starts to be really interesting to see how those things are linked very early on. I'm kind of anticipating what's going to be coming up for the next little while that I'm going to be discussing, but this is what really grabbed me in this kinds of research. So what I'm going to do for the little while that I'm going to be talking, first of all, before we open it up to questions, is really going through, since this is a methodologies seminar, I'm going to talk more about the sources that I've used to explore these ideas and how I came to use them and how I found them useful for these types of questions. So it's a little bit of a show and tell for the first part. Do please feel free to jump in at any time, interrupt me if you have questions. I want this to be more casual and less sort of formal guy in a sports jacket talking up front, but it's cold without it. So do jump in. One of the things that I was especially interested in early on was thinking about what actually constitutes the pink pound, what actually constitutes an economic relationship between LGBTQ people and business enterprise. And we have, of course, well, going back to these more recent advertisements, we're all familiar with this idea of the pink pound being, I suppose, depending on where you think power lies, is it business enterprise exploiting LGBTQ people for their money, or is it LGBTQ people deploying their economic power in different ways? Your answer to that question, or which side of the coin you fall on, is going to be really about where you think power resides. For the purposes of my research, both are very relevant because there's discussions going on. On the one hand, how do you attract consumers who are different? On the other hand, when we start talking about boycotts or things like that, we have the deployment of economic power. So both are relevant. I'm not really interested in saying the definition is one or the other, because both are very interesting. And in fact, that question is uninteresting to me, because I think what we need to do is explode that definition and think about what else can be part of a pink economy, what else can be considered relevant, valuable, important, historically interesting for thinking about relationships between sexuality and capitalism. And so, and this was a function really of going through primary sources and starting to see examples of things that I didn't expect to see, that made me think about why this definition was no longer enough. And so the working definition that I have through my work, and that I propose that we replace this orthodox definition that I was describing already with, is, sure, we include this discussion of economic interest in LGBTQ people or their deployment of their economic power, but also what about the selling, in inverted commas, in being used in multiple ways, the selling of understandings of homosexuality, sexual difference, gender difference, in different contexts. And this can be positive, progressive, supportive reform in some kind of commercial venue where the benefit is profit of talking about this. It may be overlapped with genuine political interest and genuine progressive goals, but there's a profit motive involved as well. It could also be selling homophobia. Why not? Why is not selling homophobia part of a pink economy? You're making money off of perpetuating particular understandings of homosexuality. There's money involved, there's sexuality involved. I think that if we don't include that in this wider discussion, this is a bit of an impoverished research not to consider that fullest range of relationships. If for no other reason, then it opens up what people's motivations are in speaking about sexual difference, gender difference, what have you. What about the titillation of discussing queer sexualities in different contexts, where the audience might not actually be queer people, might not actually be LGBTQ people? What about when there's titillation involved in selling something to an ostensibly straight audience or to a mainstream audience? There's something interesting to me there as well when we start thinking about why particular stories, say in the papers and magazines, I'm thinking mid-century, early 20th century, is being sold to a mainstream audience. It's still selling understandings of sexual difference and of potentially LGBTQ people. This opens up a lot more opportunities to thinking about what all of these relationships are. You can agree or disagree with that, and there's good points to be made to counter it, but I think it does open up the conversation in really useful ways and forces us to reconcile our understandings of these relationships with all kinds of other possibilities and questions. So I first encountered some of this long before it's supposed to be happening in looking at the early men's press, the early men's lifestyle press, which at the late 19th, early 20th century was this kind of hybrid, something between the trade press and a lifestyle magazine for male consumers. It was telling people, telling male consumers, aspirational, upper working class, middle class, lower middle class people, what sort of things are in season, what kind of opportunities there are for buying, what kind of products are appropriately gender, all of these things. And it would go through and, obviously had lots of advertisements as well. But what I was really interested in were the, letters from basically advisors on style and advisors on appropriate masculine costume, because they would describe what's coming in that year, what's appropriate, what's attractive, what a well-dressed man is wearing. They'd also describe what to avoid, and sometimes it was just, they would just say things like, because this is, a gentleman wouldn't wear this is impractical, this is ugly, this is whatever. Other times they would say, well, we know that a certain type of effeminate man would wear this. And I thought that was really interesting, that we start seeing these codings. And of course, effeminacy is a complex coding, but it can be linked to gender and sexual difference, particularly in this period, and can be coded along the lines of sexual difference. And there become examples further on where those links become clearer and clearer. But I thought it was interesting how they were presenting what effeminate consumption could be to identify what not to do in one context. But of course, that could also create a guide for what to buy if you want to know the codes and give the signals. So in the pre-World War I period, it comes up things like yellow kid gloves. No masculine man is going to wear yellow kid gloves. So of course, you read this and maybe you see a man wearing yellow kid gloves in the street and you're like, this might be my kind of guy. And it becomes really interesting to think about how the magazine, in this case The Modern Man, the only masculine paper, you can see it yells very loud, a journal of masculine interest, is playing with a lot of different ideas there that I thought was really interesting. It also, there was this magazine and a couple others around this time before the First World War. This one was especially interesting because it also had other articles. There was another one in there that I recall from about 1910 called Backwater Behavior. And it was talking about, it's a great title already, it was talking about complaints that were coming from residents in Teddington in London along the Thames, that there was terrible things being done by men in the in the water there, and this was they couldn't name what it was. We wouldn't sully your ears, dear reader, with the stories of what was going on at Teddington, and it was really suggestive. The language, backwater behavior, it was giving a lot of suggestions that were coded into it that this could be something queer, could be something sexual. Also, nude bathing for the editor audience. This isn't going to arouse, word deliberate, isn't going to arouse the same kind of opprobrium. I think and we know from later on that Teddington was the towpath at Teddington was a cruising area for a lot of the 20th century. But what's interesting is not just that they're saying, okay, this is going on in this part of town. It's saying, dear reader, you're all good, worthy, masculine citizens. You don't want to be associated with this kind of behavior, so you're going to want to avoid this part of Teddington. You're going to want to especially avoid Teddington on Sunday afternoons between 2 and 5. I mean, it's giving a map of queer possibilities in London before the First World War. I made the argument I think this came up in the chapter that was circulated before this seminar, that it really is providing an opportunity to publicize certain kinds of queerness and networking and possibilities in a consumer magazine, ultimately, even as it's disclaiming that in other contexts. So it can be read in multiple ways. And of course, The Modern Man it's a consumer item. This is something that I want to really hit home with. All the sources I'm using for this study, they've been used by historians before, but often more as a matter of, look, this is where discourse is happening. This is where understandings are being created and negotiated. But they're also consumer sources. When we start looking at magazines, if we look at books, there's monetary decisions behind the publication of a book. There's evaluations behind whether it's saleable or whether the risk of prosecution is too great and the threat of fine is too dangerous. There are economic decisions behind this. And historians have not typically thought about this when looking at these sources of discourse, that many of them are also consumer sources, newspapers, magazines, all these media sources, film, theater, whatnot. So I became really fascinated with those. I mean, speaking of books, this is an example of one that I found absolutely fascinating, a book that was eventually published by Rose Alatini under the pseudonym A.T. Fitzroy, called Despised and Rejected. So this was published right in the First World War, a book about a homosexual pacifist. So you can imagine how well that went over with the authorities in the midst of the First World War. It was fined under the Defense of the Realm Act and charged with significant fines. There's a whole series of stories to be told about the process by which it went through various publishing houses to finally get published, and that the whole sort of queer history of the book and consumerism and capitalism comes into play there. But what was really interesting was this letter that was sent from another author to the publisher after the fine had been levied against the publishing house for publishing this book in violation of the Defense of the Realm Act. The fine ended up being over £400 in 1918. So, 1918, we have someone called Viscount Harberton. I don't know much about him. I think he's amazing. I need to find out more about Viscount Harberton. He writes to the publisher, the pacifist publisher, C.W. Daniel. Dear Mr. Daniel, as I say, I can only hope that the summons police inflicted upon you for no offense at all may serve as an advert, at all events, for that book. In self-defense, you are now bound to push the book for all it's worth. I'll paraphrase to some extent. Basically, as soon as you can, to get back as much as possible. The fact of the book possessing Bulgarian tendencies is, to this extent, an advantage. For curiosity draws countless readers to read it, apart from the actual Bulgarians themselves. We're not talking about Southern Europeans here. Personally, I see no harm in rogering whatever you want to. It's quite natural. And dogs are not the least bit particular, nor are the Turks. The outcry on that subject is vulgar and middle class. I am yours, Harburton. So, all kinds of things that we can find wrong with Harburton. I mean, he's racist, he's classist, he's all these things, but he's also live and let live. If people want to bugger each other, it's not going to hurt anyone else. And if that's what's showing up in your book, you've got an audience that wants to read it. There are the Bulgarians, so Harburton is going to know, and Daniel is going to know. I mean, because of the closeness of the word to buggers, this is going to be associated with homosexual men. So he's thinking, there is a queer audience for this book that will buy it and spend money on it because they see their own lives in it, and that is a consumer market that you should exploit. And everyone else is going to be really curious, and they're going to want to know more about it too. So push this puppy for all you can. I don't know what happens after this. The trail runs a bit cold. But for my purposes, this letter is amazing. This is 1918. This is my smoking gun. This is someone saying there is a queer male audience that can be identified by their queerness as consumers that will want to buy this product that speaks to them and speaks to their lives. And there's everybody else that's going to be really keen on finding out more about it because of their own curiosity, the titillating possibilities, all of these things. So this is an opportunity. It is an advert. The case, the trial, the fine is an advert for you. This made my day when I found this. This is still the best source I've found in a decade on this product. Actually, I started my first PhD paper that I submitted as part that becomes part of this book was in 2004. So I don't know, is that heartening or disheartening for anyone doing a PhD right now? So in the better part of 20 years, this is the best source I ever found. And it got me interested in thinking about books and publishing and books as consumer items more. So The Well of Loneliness, many of you will be familiar with, 1928, famous book with lesbian content by Radcliffe Hall, there in the picture with her partner Una Troubridge. It was notoriously banned famously banned in 1928 because of the content. It was banned as an obscene libel, is what it was called at the time. Most of the press wasn't too concerned about the book when it came out. If anything, they said, "Oh, this is an important issue. Maybe we should pay more attention to this." But it was the Sunday Express and the editor John Gordon, I think, that famously wrote an article called "A Book That Must Be Suppressed," in which he took the position that this was a dangerous book that had to be banned. This isn't just moral anger. This is also, as others have said this. I mean, Laura Doan and Jay Prosser have talked about this book as well. This was August. This is called the silly season in the press. Circulations are low. This article was advertised in advance that there was going to be this disclosure. There was going to be something to see. There was going to be something to read to try and drum up circulation. And the language supported that. Gordon famously wrote, "I would rather give a healthy boy or a healthy girl a vial of prussic acid than this novel. Poison kills the body, but moral poison kills the soul." So, a subtle man, but also strategic. So the book itself offered him the opportunity to condemn it, and that condemnation of this queer text could provide economic opportunities for the paper in a slow part of the season. So when we start thinking about that as both political, moral, homophobic, and consumer, economic, I think that brings together really interesting questions. There's more with the book itself. Lots has been written about The Well of Loneliness, but I went back to the actual trial depositions and trial testimony, and a lot of what they did, which was really interesting, a lot of what Jonathan Cape, Radcliffe Hall's publisher, did was spoke about the book's price point as part of its defense. So their economic decisions behind where they positioned the book was part of its defense. This wasn't a morally reprehensible book because it was too expensive to fall into the hands of those that could be unduly swayed. This is for intelligent audiences and intelligence correlated with economic position in their minds. It wasn't going to go into the hands of people that weren't intellectually prepared to grapple with the ideas that were there. So there's obviously huge classist issues with that argument, but they're economic nonetheless, and it's fascinating that the defense of the book was partly economic. Another one very shortly after this is 1932, 1933. This one is about another book, a journalist called Mr. Montague Smith of the Daily Mail. He got a letter from a Mr. Fudge. Mr. Fudge worked at the Mitre Press and said to Mr. Smith, "We have a book. We have a book that's a lot like Sheila Donisthorpe's Loveliest of Friends," another book that had lesbian content, and might have even mentioned Radcliffe Hall's, it is here, Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness. We've got a book that's similar, it's a similar type of book. What we'd like you to do is condemn it in your paper. Condemn it for all you're worth, and we will indemnify you against any action. Say this book is horrible. Say this book is disgusting. Say this book will destroy children, old people, young people, everyone, and we will take no action against you. Fudge and the Mitre Press had cottoned on to the fact that Scandal sold copies of books, and Sexual Scandal could do even more. They saw that the condemnation of Radcliffe Hall's book, even though it didn't publish again in the UK legally until 1949, it became a worldwide bestseller. In the midst of the trials, she was signing contracts left, right, and center for translations and for rights in other jurisdictions. The condemnation of the trial did a lot of good for the distribution and publication of The Well of Loneliness. The Mitre Press recognized that sexual scandal and queer scandal could go a long way. And that's 1933. In the end, the book doesn't seem to have been published. This is from the Director of Public Prosecutions, and is now at Kew at the National Archives. And what they go on to say is, well, we don't want to draw further attention to this book. We can see transparently what they're doing, and we don't know if it's obscene until we see it. So we can't really do preventative action anyway. When the book comes out, we'll deal with it then. And as far as I can tell, it wasn't released, or the authorities took no further interest. And I don't have enough material to ever find out if it was published under a different title or something else. There's just, the trail runs dry. But again, what's interesting for me is that they know that there is a strong economic motivation behind the condemnation of the book, and they're recognizing this fully and completely in 1933. My project actually started entirely with this magazine called Men Only. And this is, again, another men's life. This is probably the first true men's lifestyle magazine in Britain. It still exists. It was bought by Paul Raymond in the 60s. It's a pornographic title now. In the 30s, it launched in 35. It was based on Esquire in the States, which launched in 33. And it was, a men's lifestyle magazine, proper consumption, travel, talking about wives, things like that. The genre continues today. This is going to look familiar to us in a way that maybe those earlier 20th century ones don't in quite the same way. The text is fairly straightforward for the most part, but it was the images in this case that jumped out at me. And it was, I was talking to Hakan about this beforehand. There were images I saw where I'm just like, my queer spidey sense is tingling. There's something going on here. There's something I want to know more about. And it was images like this of these two men that were crossing the street. And I found this when I was early in my PhD, and I learned later, of course, they're being coded as queer with the waved hair, too much attention to fashions, too much interest in self-presentation. It's effeminate. Colored suits, colored ties especially, are a code for queerness in this period. The way they're presented, very sharp, angled features. You can see the one's hand that's very just so. But they're not presented as ridiculous or obscene or pathetic. They're often in the magazine presented as part of the urban fabric of London in the interwar period, but also as kind of getting one over on people in really interesting ways, or having fun at others' expense. So the caption of this one, presumably the motor driver is honking at them to get out of the way, and they're at a zebra crossing, and the one is saying to him, "Oh, that's sweet of you," being honked at. It's really playful. It's not what I expected in the 30s. I expected to see pathologization. I expected to see, the best I hoped to see was pity those poor people that can't help their condition. Instead, I'm seeing, these are people that are marked as different, getting one over on others. And as I went through, I found more of these. Sales assistants are potentially queer in this genre as well. And I can see this especially in the tie advertisement, where the salesman, very angular featured, showing some of the codes of queerness, especially his own tie, and he's saying to a customer who doesn't seem well pleased, well, sir, I think we're is in italics if you can't see it, we're the type who can wear a tie such as this. The older customer, not so sure, and you can see his tie is coded non-queer consumers throughout this magazine always have black, gray, blue ties that have no pattern at all. So it becomes interesting how ties become a code, and others have written about ties as a queer code. Matt Holbrook talks about that in Queer London as well, red ties especially. But again, it's interesting how consumption is featured as a site of queerness here, the shop assistant, the site of sales, and whatnot. But it's interesting they're playing with that because, of course, Men Only is a consumer magazine selling certain understandings of consumption. So it's got to tread this line carefully, because if it's saying this world is already potentially suspect, and yet we are fully embedded in it, it's really grappling with where to position itself. And so what it did was it seemed to play the text as being very straight, for lack of a better word, and the images would signal codes to another audience. We see you, we know you're there, we know you're part of this world, and we're not stamping you down. I think there was multiple dialogues going on in this magazine. There's also another, I don't have time to get into it today, there's another entire dialogue in Men Only about women readers. Because on the one hand, there are editorials that say, it's almost like little boys putting a sign on the club door saying, no girls allowed. They basically did that in their editorials, saying, they actually had one editorial where they said, if you see a woman reading our magazine, we hope you will snatch the magazine away from her. This is not for women's eyes, this is a men's magazine, and how dare they come into our space. And then it would write letters from women who were reading the magazine saying, I love your magazine. I've really enjoyed reading this. My husband gets it and I enjoy reading it. And they'd publish their letters, signaling to other women, no, actually it's okay to read the magazine. It's really interesting. There's these really conflicting dialogues going on. And I think the one around queerness fits that model as well. And it's recognizing what's important is it's in speaking to this audience, it's recognizing that audience exists. And it shows up where it publishes letters from people that there's another letter from a woman to the magazine that accuses of being too pansy. And it says, well, I don't know what the appeal of the modern pansy is, but it certainly isn't my taste, even if it is yours, editors. It's interesting there that they chose to write. Some people have suggested that it might be a plant, that maybe they wrote that letter. I have no idea. There's no editorial records for this magazine. But the fact that they published it, whether they wrote it or not, is really interesting because it signals that someone is thinking that there are pansy readers of the magazine. There are pansy consumers of this magazine. Men who consume, who are queer, are interested in this magazine. There's really interesting things going on when we start thinking about the multiple elements of this source and how they're in conflict and conversation with each other, even in the pages of a single issue of the magazine. And it's looking, in many cases with these publications, for me, it was looking to see what are they doing that signals that they're aware of the type of people that are reading this publication. What type of ads are they putting out? What about personal ads? Are they printing personal ads? There might not be a whiff of queerness anywhere else, but then if there's all these same-sex personal ads, clearly they're reading this and someone's figuring that out. And actually that's a great transition to a magazine called Films and Filming that started in the 50s, which was, unlike some of these other magazines where I've made claims about queer purpose or queer motivations in some of the actions, and I've been criticized at in some venues for saying, but you're making all of that up, you're reading into it, you're just one of those academics that just found what you were looking for and then said, look, I found it. Films and Filming, I've spoken to editorial staff. I know that the publisher, the editors, and most of the staff identified as gay from the 50s onward. They were knowingly basically publishing a gay magazine, even though it had wide mainstream population distribution across the world. It was one of the most important accessible film magazines in the world, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But the editorial staff was all gay, and there was lots of gay subtext in there, right down to covers. They would find. I mean, all of this, of course, is films and filming is going to be very gay male, and they found images from magazines that would support that visuals that supported that understanding would be the ones they would choose for covers, for other reviews. They would even find something if they're reviewing a completely non-queer film, that there's no queer subtext at all in a film, they would find an image of someone changing, or someone where they're leaned over and their butt showing, or something like that, and that would be what they would use for the review image, completely out of context. But they knew their audience, and they knew what they wanted to see, and they would play with those. So I mean, here's one too from the '60s where they've got one man is looking up his rugby shorts, the rugby shorts of his teammates, and it's called Gay Time. There might not have been, what is this, Bachelor of Hearts. It's a gay, lighthearted comedy. About life at Cambridge University. This was not planned. And I should say, this is, of course, gay. There's a history to when these words are used. And gay is an import. It's not going to be widely used, especially until the 70s in this country. This is mid-60s, mid to late 60s, I think this caption is. It's really kind of at that cusp where this is, a lot of so-called gay people wouldn't have read that necessarily even to mean the same thing at the time. So this really was coded even for queer people in the 60s. But others weren't so much. They would look at Rock Hudson and Dirk Bogarde, who they're apparently the kind of men who'll read films and filming. Take that as you will. We've got Anthony Perkins, legs splayed wide open. Alain Delon, they loved Alain Delon. If you could put Alain Delon topless anywhere in the magazine, that helped circulation. So they were definitely putting Alain Delon as often as they could. Also advertisements. This is very little of this model's anatomy is left to the imagination, and that's an ad from 1956, I think, by a shop called Vince Mann's Shop that was run by, unsurprisingly, a guy who went by the name Vince. He'd been a physique photographer right after the war, and basically just did the same kind of photography for his advertisements in films and filming as he did to sell on a queer market 10, 20 years earlier. One of his other models, do you recognize the other one? Sean Connery. People loved this ad of Sean Connery. It was showing up. It shows up in oral histories where people are like, Vince had Sean Connery. Did you see him in those shorts? It's shown up a few times in oral histories. But we can see, we have histories of Vince that we know this was a notorious queer West Soho menswear shop, and here it is advertising in films and filming. Then, as I mentioned, personal advertisements. Broad-minded bachelor seeks friends. Well, this is friends of both sexes anywhere. So we could have bisexuality there. What else do we have? There's always London Bachelor 31 wishes to correspond, meet with others, interests, music, theater, ballet, cinema, books, photograph appreciated. What else? There's some really great ones. This would be early mid-60s. Young gentleman, 25, ex-public school, compiling anthology of civil and military corporal punishment. Requires assistance. Please write giving details. This is a good one at the top. Active young bachelor. And I don't know if this could be, I've got to do more work on the etymology of these words, when active, passive, versatile, when that's sort of coming into parlance, but they are just using some of these words. Active young bachelor, 26, music lover, interested in most things, wishes to correspond with similar anywhere. Peter Bonsall Boone, he gave his full name. Peter Bonsall Boone, I discovered, from Australia, was involved in the first same-sex kiss on Australian television. But yeah, you've got all of these. I mean, unconventional bachelor. I mean, everything with bachelor is coded with this. What else? 2 male models available for artists and photographic work, mid-20s duos and singles. I mean, these are sex workers, I expect. They showed up multiple times in there. There's others that say, I'm very interested in sailors. Would anyone send me pictures? I've got, we could have a flat share. Genuine interests only, please send picture. Young men interested in ballet, opera, wrestling, please send pictures. All of these things show up over and over. It's wonderful. And I've spoken to people who use these personals to actually meet other men. So we can see queer men knew they could find other queer men in films and filming. Advertisers like Vince cottoned onto this too and knew these are the guys that are going to buy my stuff. I can advertise there as well. It's taking these different elements of the magazine, even when, say, you might read the content and the film reviews are by world-leading reviewers. It's just they'll review Ben-Hur. I mean, okay, there's plenty of queerness in Ben-Hur, but the review is going to be a standard review. The tabloids, I mentioned that earlier. There is, of course, a long history of horrific homophobia in the tabloids in the 50s. I'm not going to go into extensive detail on this, but I think it's really interesting to think about how that becomes an economic decision as well, and thinking out this is part of circulation wars in the 1950s. What I'm getting more interested in now is why did queer people, like others, consume the tabloids in such numbers? And I've spoken to people about that, and it's interesting to think about why are queer people consuming homophobic, vitriolic materials? Why are they buying? Why are they deploying their economic power to support the Sunday Pictorial, which became the Sunday Mirror? This becomes interesting for me. They're thinking about things like, I've read oral histories and spoken to people that are looking for news reports on whether their friends have been arrested in cottaging raids. They're looking for, some of them are reading this as erotic material. It's describing sexual activities in places, lavatories, Turkish baths that they may or may not go to themselves, but there's a titillation to that. What about straight consumers? What about non-queer consumers that are the vast majority of the tabloids readership that are also reading these avidly? There is a significant titillation element there to getting all this information about queer sex subcultures and where it happens as well. There's economic motivations in place there as well. And these go on. They were horrific throughout the 50s and 60s. They would name and shame famous people like John Gielgud. This one here, They Infested a City, is a whole list of people and their addresses in the Midlands. And this was in the national press. And it continues on to the period in which this became the Sunday Mirror. There's a famous article here, How to Spot a Possible Homo. And it gives all kinds of advice. But what's interesting here too is that association with consumerism is highlighted right away. So this isn't just that it's in a tabloid with multi-million person circulation. The very first line of the article, so how do you spot a possible homo? Well, you can and will meet them in London's Bond Street, Tokyo's Ginza, Rome's Via Veneto, Glasgow's Schuylkill Hall, I don't know how to say it, Schuylkill Hall Street, and the road to Mandalay, and the street where you live, ... But the first streets are all famously commercial streets. You'll find them in commercial spaces, lapping up the luxury of the urban opportunity to consume. That association of queerness and consumption is absolutely fascinating and is a significant part of that story as well. Where I finish this, when I give this as a long talk, is by the time we get to post-decriminalization and early gay liberation, when then some of these things could be published more openly. And Jeremy was one of the earlier gay queer magazines, launched in 1969, and could openly talk about these issues in a way that wasn't coded in the same way. And it becomes in some ways less interesting to me at that point when this consumer interest can be openly discussed, because I became really fascinated in what the sources were for finding it when it wasn't supposed to exist. I got fascinated with finding stories of relationships that weren't supposed to happen. I was absolutely fascinated with these sources that made my queer spidey sense tingle, which is, I think, a real genuine part of my methodology. That there is, because I've flipped through hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pages and probably missed tons of things, but something catches your eye, something that you want to pursue further, something that you want to explore because it's genuinely interesting and you don't have an answer to it and it doesn't make any sense. I started this project with Men Only, the men's magazine from the 1930s, thinking I was going to write a PhD on appropriate masculine consumption in the interwar period. And then I opened up that magazine, and there was, in fact, I didn't show the cartoon that got this all going. It was a cartoon of two guardsmen holding their swords, so you know the guardsmen, the big bear hats, holding their swords erect in front of them. One of them saying, "Oh, Trevor, doesn't your sword look lovely?" To which Trevor responds, "Oh, thank you, I've just had it chromium plated." What the hell did that mean? So I started going through it, and I started to understand then what the codes of queerness were. I discovered that the guardsmen were well known for participating in as sex workers well through the 20th century, that there was a sexual economy that involved guardsmen that was well known. and appeared in the press as well. I started to recognize these codes of angular features as being signaled as queer as well. I started to see more of these in the magazine, seeing they were speaking to a range of people that would understand what these subcultural references were. And then I started looking up words. And I'm like, something else as well. And then there's the erect swords. That was pretty obvious. And there's a really amazing book called Eric Partridge's Dictionary of Slang and Unconventional English. It's about that thick. I discovered that plating, so his sword is chromium plated. Plating, apparently in the 30s, was slang for oral sex. Well, that's intriguing. And chromium was a lot like crow, which was slang for both male and female prostitutes. So this was something I never would have gotten, and this was clearly using slang and referencing slang that only some of the magazine's consumers would understand. The slang itself wasn't necessarily queer, but on top of everything else, that reference to prostitution with the guardsmen and with this kind of language of chromium plating was a bit too much, wasn't it? Everything was falling into place. I'll leave it with that because I think the most exciting thing about these kinds of projects is where the sources take you that you don't expect. And I went far too long in my enthusiasm, but let's talk.